Hello, this is the second video in the series of posts that attempt to explain more clearly the idea of creating lasting effects for both heroes and villains by splitting the hero die of a given power. The last video that I did, I think worked pretty well, but then it dawned on me that I actually overstated my case a little bit in the video by lumping all of the examples under the category of static effects. And that isn't really what I intended. And if I'd paid a little more attention to my notes, I would have noticed that. So I want to clarify and expand on what I talked about in the last video in this video. So first thing I need to do is I need to get my whiteboard up and running. So ta-da, there my whiteboard is now up and running, and I need to adjust the size of my screens a little bit here and there. I have notes off over to the side that I will be cutting and pasting. So I need to make sure I can still see those. That sounds like a good idea, I think. So in essence, in the last video, I talked about splitting hero dice to create effects. And I called those static effects, but that wasn't quite accurate because some of the effects weren't static. And let me expand on that idea here. When we create lasting effects, there are really three basic categories of them that I could think of for how the rules work, and narratively speaking, what seems to make the most sense. And those three types of effects are static, active, and useful. And as I mentioned last time, I talked about the static effects as if those were the only type of effect there are, and that's not really accurate. Not really. So static effects, a static effect does just what it does, more or less in one place without much variation. They are in some ways probably the most common types of effects in comic books, but at the same time they're perhaps also the least interesting type of effect. And I did have examples of these in the last video. Specifically, those examples were Magma's Wall of Fire D8 and the Minotaur powers that Chimera got by turning into a Minotaur, so the great strength, the resistance to harm, and whatnot. Boy, I wobbled off camera there for a minute. Sorry, focus. The Minotaur powers in Chimera's example, they're there. That's what he does until he decides to use his transmorphism for something else. Just like in Magma's case, that Wall of Fire is pretty much going to stay there until one, somebody puts it out, or two, Magma decides she's done with it, in which case it would be gone. Now, I also talked about active effects a little bit. And the active effect in this case is, it's much like a villain. It gets a place in its initiative order. It will behave according to its nature. It has a certain number of hit points. It has a certain amount of protection. And the big example here from the last video was Fission's Atomic Monster D12. Right? That Atomic Monster D12 would get an initiative card. It would get to act just like it was another villain on the board, so to speak. And it could do whatever you would expect a villain to be able to do that was an Atomic Monster D12, to include perhaps even the Atomic Monster splitting its D12 die up to create other effects. And this is somewhat problematic for Atomic Monster because it would lower Atomic Monster's protection, making it more vulnerable to attacks. But, hey, that's life. Life has trade-offs. Then the third type of lasting effect that can be created by splitting a power's die is a useful effect. And this is an effect that benefits either the user or another character by adding additional abilities, perhaps most commonly additional damage and or additional protection. It is most appropriate to see if a useful effect downgrades after being used. The narration may dictate that other types of effects might downgrade as well. That's up to you as the editor and your writers to determine, you know, within the context of whatever story it is you're telling. And I did have some examples here. Actually, I had one example here of this kind of useful effect, and that was when I talked about fission, for example, creating 4 blaster rifles D10 and then handing those blaster rifles out to his henchmen to use as weapons. For another example, the villain that I released last month, Putty, has the power of to control rubber. He can control rubber. Yeah, what? Because he's Putty. That only makes sense. So, for example, if Putty were to, I don't know, you know, strip the tires off of several vehicles nearby and then use those tires to form hard rubber armor D6 around himself in order to get an extra 4 points of protection, that would be the kind of thing that I would probably check to see every time it gets hit, every time it absorbs damage, whether or not that die downgrades. And then if it downgrades, it would reduce the protection afforded by that hard rubber armor as well. So shorter video this time, but hopefully one that makes my thoughts a little more clear on what I was thinking when I did lasting effects. The section in the rule book on lasting effects is perhaps too vague, and so I figured, you know, a few more examples wouldn't hurt to help clarify things. As always, if you've watched this video, if you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate them to, no, that's not right. Don't hesitate them. Don't hesitate to send them my way. And that is all I have time for this video today. I will finish up this series of posts about lasting effects probably sometime in the next few days. Thank you very much, and have fun. Bye.